I'm Tobias Revel.
And I'm Radha Mystery.
And this is Futur-ish, a podcast about how nothing is new and everything has happened before.
We've been working and playing in futures for over a decade of hype and bluster amidst increasing uncertainty and complexity.
In each episode, we explore a recent event or signal for its historical context and speculate on future possibilities.
And make it make sense for people like you and me.
Hi! This week's episode features a conversation with our friend luminary designer Nick Foster, whose new book, Could, Should, Might, Don't, How We Think About the Future, is, as of the release of this episode, already out in the United States and on its way to the UK and Europe. Radha and I have both read the book and even had a chance to contribute to it, so it's a real thrill to get to spend some time talking with Nick about his reflections on writing a book in the space of design, futures, technology, all that jazz, as well as hosiery. As I was editing this episode, I realized that at no point did we introduce Nick, the book, or the context of the conversation, which just shows the level of professionalism with which we're operating, but also that this really is just a continuation of Radha and mine's WhatsApp conversations. Anyway, I hope you enjoy the episode, and I really, really encourage you to go and buy and read Nick's book.
I've stolen my husband's podcast setup, so he's a professional podcaster.
There you go. We all are really these days, aren't we?
Well, we don't pay you money for this, Nick.
Wait, what?
That's the thing you can do. So I was going to say two things. One is it would be really great for people to learn more about our dear friend, Nick Foster. And also, I read the book and I read your New York Times article and I felt both seen and attacked in a really splendid way.
Oh, that's nice. That's nice.
But yeah, Nick, if you could introduce yourself, and I'd love for you to talk a little bit about why even write a book like this?
Yeah, I'm Nick. I was born and raised in Derby, British man, American now. Been here for about 13 years, which has flown by. So I'm a futures designer, which is a term that I made up because I couldn't quite wear futurist. I trained as an industrial designer and gradually sort of drifted towards the more future-focused projects coming through the studios and the companies where I worked, which began in Dyson back in the 90s. I was one of the first engineers there. Went to the RCA, started working in agencies, doing projects for everyone from toothbrush manufacturers and chocolate bar makers through to luxury car brands. And then moved in-house to Sony, then Nokia, Google, and then became head of design at Google X. So over my career, it's been very much focused on sort of technology and making of consumer products, I would say. And during that career, it's drifted ever more pronounced towards the sort of long-term futures-oriented type of projects that exist in those companies. I left Google X in 2023. And for context, I turned 50 in February. And I think everybody gets a bit reflective at this point in their life. And they either write a book or they buy a Porsche. And I can't afford a Porsche, so I wrote a book. But just to be a bit sort of pointed and prickly here, I really didn't want to write one of those books. And by those books, I mean either here's my manifesto for the future as it should be lived and how it should exist, or here's my method, here's my 5-step plan that I'm going to roll out over the next 12 weeks on LinkedIn. I didn't want to write one of those books. I wanted to write a book which felt a bit more honest than that and actually picked under the surface of how we think about the future. And when I say we, I kind of mean everybody. Some of us do it for a job. I think all of us do it out of curiosity, out of fear, out of a hobby. And I feel like it's a skill that's incredibly important. And yet most of the people I interact with on a public level and on a private and a business level don't seem to be very good at it. And when I say not very good, I mean not very rigorous. So the book is called Could, Should, Might, Don't, which is 4 buckets of thinking that I think we all fall into when we start to contemplate what the future holds.
I guess I'm interested, just really quickly, why particularly a book? As a designer, what drew you to doing a book?
That's a really good question, actually. I've always found writing to be a means of making sense of my own brain. And I've found in the past when I haven't written things down, my ideas come out badly formed, badly articulated. I don't have my fingers on the statistics or the information that I want. And I found that writing has been a way to bring that together so that when called upon to have an opinion, it's sort of there in the cortex ready to go. After doing futures work for, I guess, 25 years, I just wanted to sort of figure out what my reckons were. in an orderly way. And that just sort of grew and grew and grew. And I started to share it with a few people and they said, there might be a book here. So, that led to a pitch, and the pitch went to agents, and agents went to publishers and signed a book deal. And then you're on the hook and you have a book. I think when you write a nonfiction book, if you're trying to cover a topic area, there are inevitably bits that either you don't know much about or you've willfully ignored for your whole career because you're not interested in them, but you're sort of duty bound to study them. And actually, I found bits of interest in some of them, actually. Like, there's more about whatever think tanks than I thought there was. Also, books reach a lot of different sorts of people. I think design work reaches either the people who are paying for it or other designers. That's basically it. But I think when you write a book, it can reach other people. And I had that ambition to try and reach a lay person audience, a regular reader who can just say, I think about the future. Maybe this book's for me. So yeah, I think books have a bit more reach and different people seem interested in them.
It's funny that you say that there's parts of the kind of context building that you weren't familiar with. What in the book felt like most surprising as you were writing it?
My goodness, that's a really good question. I mean, bits of all of it. There were also things that I've been saying a lot in public that I did research on and then realized weren't true, which,
Oh, no.
Yeah, you know what I mean, though. Like, I think we all do that. These sort of standing waves of truth that live in our brains, and we say them with confidence, and they become true. And then you look at the actual quote, or you look at the actual information, and you think that's not actually right. So that happened quite a lot, which is good. Just fact checking. I never really considered think tanks to be a place where futures happen, but it obviously is when you think about the future of public policy and the future of politics. They're clearly where a lot of that thinking and that action actually happens. And when you dig into them, they're incredibly sort of in their concept, at least, they're very, very old institutions, things like RUSI and other sort of defense-oriented think tanks. But the thing that's terrifying is how quickly they've gone from being places where you can have open-ended thought and discussion and conversation about the future of policy and society into basically campaign houses, places that actually just pressure people into thinking a certain way and build dossiers of information. But yeah, that was an area I'd never really looked at, studied.
You haven't mentioned at all the 20 odd minutes of voice notes I sent you about eschatology.
Maybe we can do that on a separate call. Yeah.
Just take that offline.
Book two. You know this as well as I do. You're both very esteemed practitioners in this field. You can go super deep on one page of the book that I've written, and I think if it could be accused of anything, it could be accused of being a bit glib and skipping through everything. But what I wanted to do is to create a book that sort of touched on everything in that field and said, this is what I think we think of when we think of the future. Feel free to go deeper yourselves, but it is a subject. And even if, like, a layperson, somebody that doesn't work in our field, picks it up, I hope they can make it from cover to cover and be like, there's definitely something there for me. Because I do worry sometimes, particularly in professional futures work, the circle gets tighter and tighter and the cone gets narrower and narrower until you're sort of talking to the same 200 people. And I worry then it just becomes this sort of abstract academic act.
One of the things I really liked about it, I know we've talked about this a lot and we talk about it a lot, Radha and I as well, is when Radha and I were starting out, I think we were at the tail end of, like, or maybe we were naive, an optimistic sense of the future. Technology was exciting. Things were going to come along that were going to solve real issues, like, we were going to 3D print medicines at home or whatever it was. And over time, that sort of dwindled and it became increasingly centralized in a handful of companies. And one of the things I think this book does quite well, and I was really happy to see put so accessibly, was the methods and the ways by which that has happened over time, by these promises, these should promises, the different frameworks and rhetorics and methods that you've explored through examples about how what might appear like an abundant future is actually a kind of pre-designed foreclosed future. And then I think the last chapter, even though it's called Don't, the last section kind of offers some hope, right? It offers like the alternative.
Yeah, I hope so. I mean, there's a multitude of ways to read this book. And I think anyone that's known me for long enough, I guess gets the vibe that I can be quite critical of a lot of the ways
You're in the wrong place.
You're
in the wrong place.
What?
But I like to hope that it's not simply sitting back and wagging a finger. I just think that we do tolerate a remarkable lack of rigor at every level when talking about, thinking about, and producing work about the future in a way that we just wouldn't and don't with any work pertaining to the present. We just hold people unaccountable to any number of flaws, errors, mistakes, willful misguidance. And I think that what I've tried to do in the book is say, I think each of these could, should, might, and don't mindsets, I think they exist. I think they're pretty obvious to anyone that's been around this sort of work. So I take quite a good swing at could futurism because it's often what people expect from me. So could futurism is this very kind of bombastic, modernist, technocratic vision of a hopeful future where it comes from sort of science fiction and monorails and robo-dogs and all the stuff you see when you type the future into Google. And it comes from that place of optimism and hope that sort of I grew up in the 80s. That, wow, the future's going to be amazing because of tech that you kind of referred to. And it's good because it sweeps people up and it gets them excited and it gets them motivated. It's also really easy to digest. And when I get asked to give talks on stage, like I'm assuming you do, people sort of think you're going to talk about the future in those terms. The problem is it's just sort of willfully optimistic in a way that's not helpful. And it also pitches the future as over there somewhere, like a distant place that one day we might get to, but it doesn't ever want to talk about the transition from now to there. And so with each of those categories of thinking, what I've tried to do is try to be honest and say, I do see the benefit in this and I can see where it comes from and I can see why you're motivated to think of the world in these ways. But I don't think we embrace just how underpowered a lot of these ways of thinking are on their own in isolation and when done without looking laterally at perhaps the other three. And so far, fingers crossed, most people seem to think I've not either missed a big one out or disagree entirely with the premise of the book. So
I really appreciated your point of view on like the futurist moniker, because that's something that I think all of us have struggled with. And I don't think any of us identify with that. And it's something I certainly don't. But I was reading the Might chapter and I was like, oh no, this chapter is about us. And the second section was like strategic foresight. So that's where I felt, again, seen and attacked, but I think in a really good way, because like I said, I think you are very fair in the way you lay out your arguments, kind of for and against.
On the note about the futurist thing, I mean, for the sake of listeners, let's say, it's curious. Do you like that title for yourself, Tobias? Do you ever use it?
I do not use it. I consider myself a designer who just happens to be practicing in the future space, but could just do infographics or something equally as well, or as I do like installation art and things, that's fine.
I call myself a designer in the most general sense. Like that's what I believe. I think my focus at the moment is futures and I think I really love it, but I don't know, maybe I'll be a ceramicist, you know?
It's sort of curious how certainly people I look up to and respect also have similar challenges with futurist as a title. And I think the reason I feel uncomfortable, I also feel like a designer who happens to work in this territory. Like some people work in buildings, some people work in ceramics. I work in thinking about the future and I use the tools of design, drawing, filmmaking, writing, whatever else, making to communicate my stories. But I honestly think a lot of the work that is produced by futurists is of just subpar quality. And I sort of don't want to be part of that. And I think I could wear the title futurist because it is quite close to what I do, I think, if the quality of the work of that cohort increased. And if the audience start demanding better work from their futurists, they'll have to increase the quality of that work. And then maybe I'll feel more comfortable saying, yeah, I call myself that. That's fine. When people say a futurist is coming, they're sort of like, ooh, goody, I'm going to see big statistics and crazy images and whiz-bang wow things. And I always feel like at least I'm disappointing people. So it just feels uncomfortable. I don't like that label for myself.
I wonder, though, if that's possible for futurism. In thinking about it as you're talking, to me, the futurist as an archetype is something of the fool, right? There's someone who is there to throw kind of rhetorical bombs around and narrative ideas and enliven an audience and motivate them in different ways, like a court jester or something. So I wonder if, that's just the role of futurists and we just have to accept that and call ourselves something else.
Yeah, maybe so.
Yeah, maybe it'll change one day. Well, I felt like you were going to segue, Tobias. Take it away.
So you were mentioning, that for this idea of the bell curve and that for most people, their experience of the future is mundane. And I think I first properly dug into your work with an article you wrote in 2013 in the renowned design blog Core 77 called The Future Mundane. And I still use your rules of the future mundane all the time, and we'll share them in the show notes and on the screen. But that brings us to the gift, the offering you brought us in the form of your signal. What have you got?
I've always been fascinated by this idea of the hidden, ordinary kind of underbelly of society, culture, technology, whatever it is that just dominates everything and it becomes invisible, which I refer to as the future mundane. And I found it a really powerful way of thinking about the future, which is what are the ordinary, everyday lived experiences? We love to talk about emerging technologies and all of the sort of radical change in the world to the point where it blinds us to the dominance of these ordinary things. And the stat that I use is this one, which is if we just talk about VR headset hardware, credible estimates for that market value is about $10 to $11 billion, which is not insignificant. That's a chunk of money. If you combine all of AR and VR together, most people think that is about $17 billion. And if you look at the whole VR ecosystem, so headset, software, services, everything, that's about $20 billion, which is a big thing. But then the majority of sources that I've been able to find value the global sock market at about $55 billion, which is 2 to 3 times the size of that market. Now, immediately we can talk about, well, one's new and one's established. But the point that I think I'm trying to make here is it is a huge thing, a huge industry that is growing, and it keeps growing. Everybody wears socks, and yet we don't think about them when we talk about the future. It's all VR, or it's all AI, or it's all robotics. But socks is 3 times the size as an industry of the VR industry. And I just don't think we're able to talk about that in reasonable ways.
Is it because there's nothing new to invent? Like there's no new territory, there's not a new frontier in socks. Whereas perhaps in AR and VR, it feels like there is a claim you can stake on something.
Well, interesting you should say that. I've been digging into sock market trends because I've got little else to do with my time. But you'd be surprised, actually, that there's a huge amount of sort of positivity about the growth around socks. And it comes from things like the boom in fitness wear and athleisure. More and more people are now looking for performance socks. There are things like e-commerce and subscription models around socks now. So companies like Stance and Happy Socks and Bombas all have subscription models for socks. Also health, all of the people who are struggling with sort of body-related health, so diabetes, blood pressure. Socks is a huge market that's growing, medically kind of prescribed socks. More and more people are moving from rural spaces where maybe they weren't wearing socks into urban spaces where they're expected to wear socks with regular footwear. So again, we're not necessarily talking about double-digit month-on-month growth here, but it is still a market that's incredibly healthy and growing and changing with the changing demographics of the world. I was also finding out there's this place called near the Yangtze River Delta, near Guangzhou and Yiwu, is this place called Datang, which has become known as Sock City. So in the 70s and 80s, villages there began knitting socks as a bit of a side hustle. And the Chinese government got interested and started investing in that place. Over time, everything related to socks became centralized in this one place that's now known as Sock City. And the stats that I have is that one town has 8,000 sock-related enterprises, and it produces 8 billion pairs of socks a year, which is 1/3 of the world's socks. So that town produces 253 pairs of socks a second.
What?
And it has multi-story shopping malls filled with just sock shops from each of the different distributors and manufacturers for all of the world's sock sellers to go to, see samples, commission new products. What country do you think is number 2 in the world for sock production? After
India?
Sock City, not India. One more guess, Tobias, you get one.
I'll say it's somewhere in South America, but I'm going to leave it there.
Incorrect. Turkey. Turkey is the second biggest producer of socks globally, producing around 10% of the world's socks. Other mundane stuff that has huge market cap. Paper towels and tissues is a $100 billion industry. Deodorant and antiperspirant is $30 billion industry. Underwear is a $100 billion industry. And toothpaste and oral care is about $60 billion. So again, these are all bigger than VR by 2, 3, 4 times. And again, it's because they're mass adopted and they're established industries. I get that. But there's nothing to say they won't be there in any vision you can paint of 2040, 2050. And I think that consideration is kind of what I'm picking at.
I was immediately thinking of our earlier conversation about futurists and the sort of showmanship of futurists. And a stat I often quote is that the McKinsey Metaverse report estimated that the Metaverse was going to be worth $5 trillion by 2030. You know, on the opposite end of the scale. And so that it's sort of incumbent on futurists to motivate investment with these unprovable, uncredible kind of statistics and projections. I was actually just looking at McKinsey's metaverse subsite, which they were updating weekly until June 2023, when seemingly activity stopped for some reason. But that's almost the opposite, isn't it? That's the big thing, is you've got to make the metaverse worth $5 trillion, because unlike stocks, there's no use for it immediately for most people. And so you attach an arbitrary number to it to give it some value.
It feels like we just sort of struggle to think about these types of ordinary everyday things in conversations that I have with people. It's almost like they're so boring and so unimportant and so unimaginative. We're not even going to consider it. And I just think that that smacks of a lack of imagination, a lack of reality, a lack of ability of sort of rigorous, detailed storytelling.
I think that's the ironic thing, right? Because when people are upset about policy, or they're kind of angry about their current circumstances or the health of the economy, they're not complaining about the cost of a VR headset. They're complaining about the cost of eggs or the cost of diapers, or that they can't access their favorite brand of milk or whatever it might be. Those should be very critical elements of the ways that we shape futures. It's just not sexy to talk about it, though.
It is
right?
interesting, though, isn't it? It's funny how quickly it goes down to a photograph of a shopping basket where you have like 100 items that are tracked, and eggs have gone up because of this, and this has gone down because of import duties or whatever else, which is why the news always shows pictures of cartons of milk, packs of eggs, a pat of butter, and says this has gone up 11% because this tariff on cows or whatever it is. A fella on the stage pointing at a robot doesn't feel relatable to people, so it always seems abstract.
I think there's also a job here delaminating the idea of design from like its heroic pretenses. It's not designing the next perfect gadget or solving everything through one simple intervention. There's something about how do you as a designer remember that most people's connection with the ideas and concepts that are starting to dominate their future don't come from big shiny devices or big shiny screens. They're coming from, how come the packaging has been designed this way so I can't carry it properly? That kind of stuff. And so in education, how do we delaminate design as a heroic profession?
The work's definitely different than when I was a student. And the work when I was a student was very, to use your term, heroic. It was very like, this is an amazing new thing I've designed and developed. And it's sort of one of the reasons I was led into Dyson. These were technocratic, future-oriented, technology-driven objects that we were going to make, and we were going to change the way people did things. And everything was a problem, and design was the solution. But do you think that the next generation are still thinking that way?
In London, in a London context, design in the university is at its peak seriousness, I would say, to the point where, if I'm being perhaps a little unfair and candid, most of the projects are impenetrable. Having taught and written curriculums for a decade and doing a PhD in design, I can read a project description 3 times and be like, I don't actually know what this is or what it's about or why it exists, but it's talking about Donna Haraway, or it says more than human or something, and it's a skull with an LED in it. And I'm like, okay, but all right.
I would say, like, from maybe a US perspective, there's 2 things happening right now. One, there's some students who are very heavily into kind of like social justice and climate impact and things like that, and that feels very top of mind for them. But there's also this other conversation happening around authorship, primarily with the use of like 2D and 3D AI tools. And so I think it's the other problem, Tobias, where students maybe are trying to decipher their point of view in a field where the kind of decision making, the aesthetic is so heavily embedded in the tool itself that a lot of what we're asking them to do is to begin to separate themselves from that and to maybe go back to some of that more like serious theory that was built by human beings, right? I actually think university is where you kind of get to be a little bit of the like Howard Rorkean designer figure, because you don't get to do that out in practice. I think when you get into practice is when you get to have a little bit more of that like practicality and the honing in and the maybe becoming more serious about like the who you are designing for and the audience.
I do agree with that peak seriousness stuff and it becoming impenetrable. And I still think like developing my own perspective on what the function of a design education is as well. Because on the one hand, there is a sort of heavily vocational thing where we train people to go straight into a workforce. And then there's the sort of, no, it's the one time in your life when you can just play and explore or like build your criticality. And I think it's sort of all of them, but it becomes this sort of muddled mess. And there's the sort of pragmatic reality that everybody, especially now, needs to work to make ends meet. And are we equipping people with the right sort of mix to be able to earn some sort of a living? But the thing that's really missing is design as imagination. Just that pure exploratory, creative, bringing people along for the ride, getting them interested, getting them excited, getting them engaged. I don't really see a lot of that. And I feel like that's a weakness.
Universities and design education also, they straddle society and the education complex. If you're going to keep having public exhibitions and putting on big public events, you also have a sort of advocacy duty for design as a whole to a public. And if you can't connect it with people thinking about what's in their shopping baskets or, how the light switch works, then the value of that connection isn't there, I don't think.
Yeah, and it goes back to that conversation about the narrowing cone of audience. You need to make the futures you're telling easy to understand, digestible, and applicable, and sort of desirable, like attractive. Like find a way to make them interesting and attractive that I don't see a lot of at the moment.
But how do you make like mundane futures attractive?
Well, I think they're at least relatable. They use language and scenarios and stories that people find interesting. The problem is then communicating that out to shareholders, customers, other people. I'd love to see a CEO stand on a stage and tell you all the things that they were excited about and all the things that they were building, but then go on to say, these are the things that we're still not quite sure about and we're trying to figure out. These are things that could go wrong and we're trying our best to keep that open. Come help us figure them out. Like that kind of conversation around the future, you just don't sort of see, and ground it a bit. Just ground it and say, make it relevant for Mickey the welder or whoever. Like make it sort of part of their everyday conversation as opposed to those folks over there doing this stuff to me. I write a bit about this in the book, that notion of toxic positivity where within an organization, and I've been part of some of the biggest organizations that are doing sort of new technology things, there's always not enough money and there's always too many ideas. And so the ones that get the money and the headcount and the budget and the time are the ones that sell themselves the best. So everybody is in advertising, which leads to this toxic positivity in these organizations where saying, I'm unsure, just is the pure way to kill your project or to lose all your budget. And I think that it would be great if we could find a way around that where you think, actually, there's a nub of an idea there and I share your concerns, but let's move forward with caution. But I think there's something interesting there rather than I've identified a problem. Here's how we can solve it. Go on stage and tell everyone it's amazing and you can have $50 million and 20 headcount.
I think that's one of the things that over the last few years of moving into a corporate sector, I've sort of developed these tactics of getting those conversations going by starting with the problem that the stakeholder is facing. It sounds like incredibly prosaic to say, but again, in that lineage of heroic designers, the amount of time someone barges in a room and goes, I've solved it, I've come up with the perfect UX framework and it's going to fix it, rather than going, what are you struggling with here? Tell me about that. And then going, okay, I see why using some design here and playing with these ideas and we can iterate and prototype and test might help you, if not solve the problem, come at it a different direction and take it, I wouldn't ever use the word playful in that conversation, but essentially playfully, let's actually, be designery about it and deconstruct it into its component parts and see if we can rearrange it in a different way.
You're right. I think there's that notion that you mentioned about coming into a room and saying, I've solved it. Here's the thing. It feels old fashioned to me. And I think moving forward with a bit of humility and a bit of uncertainty, particularly around the technology of the day that shall not be named, is by its very nature an uncertain, amorphous, kind of wonky technology that's behaving in ways that we can't quite see and can't quite predict. So our work should necessarily change accordingly. And a bit of that uncertainty and saying, well, there's some interesting things here actually that it can point at that could address some things that we would like to see changed. But there also is a new way of thinking about design, which is helping people understand what they should stop and what they should put an end to and what actually we don't need this anymore. I know we've had an org or a team or a product line, but it doesn't sort of make sense anymore. We should stop that. So finding ways to change how we talk about design in these large organizations is something that I don't have the answers to at all. But I do think that design needs to find its own place again in these places.
Unless you're doing socks, in which case that appears to be an ongoing concern without end.
I mean, I'm genuinely fascinated, and I feel like I might do a book on socks. It feels like one of those. I guess if you work in socks, everything we're saying is well known.
Well, Nick, I was going to say, for someone who says you don't have the answers, it sure seems like you know a lot. So thank you for hanging out with us and our ridiculousness and humoring us a little bit. To all of our listener out there, singular maybe, buy the book, Could, Should, Might, Don't. It's really fun. It's very useful. And yeah.
It's been a privilege. Thank you.